By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the concept of strict liability, understand the reasoning behind strict liability crimes, evaluate strict liability crimes, and use case law to support and illustrate the ideas above. Strict liability crimes are offences where the prosecution does not need to prove the mens rea regarding at least one element of the offence. All that is needed is the voluntary actus reus, and of course the absence of a valid defence. An example of a strict liability crime is shown in the case of Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain v. Storquain. In this case, a pharmacist dispensed prescription drugs on the basis of forged prescriptions. The pharmacist had no knowledge that the prescriptions were forged, and the forgeries were very convincing. The pharmacist was charged under Section 58(2)(a) of the Medicines Act 1968, which prohibited the supply of certain medicines without a valid prescription signed by a doctor. The issue was whether the pharmacist could be held liable despite their lack of intent or negligence in verifying the prescriptions. The House of Lords upheld the conviction, ruling that strict liability applied, meaning it was unnecessary to prove intent or negligence, i.e. mens rea. The pharmacist was held liable simply because the prohibited act, dispensing drugs without a valid prescription, had occurred. To access an overview of all cases outlined in this lesson, a revision summary of this topic, quizzes, the PowerPoint lesson I am using, and many more, visit my test store, link in my channel description. The defence of mistake arises when a defendant acts under a genuine and reasonable belief in certain facts which, if true, would negate the mens rea required for the offence. The defence of mistake is not available in strict liability cases because the mens rea is not required. This means that if the defendant makes a mistake, even a reasonable one, they will still be held criminally liable. We can see this in the case of Prince. In this case, the defendant, Prince, took an unmarried girl under the age of 16 away from the possession of her father. Prince believed in good faith that the girl was 18 years old. The girl, in fact, was 14, but she had told Prince she was older. The court held that the offence was one of strict liability regarding the age of the girl. Prince's belief that the girl was over 16 was irrelevant because mens rea concerning her age was not required for this offence. The act of taking the girl was prohibited, and strict liability was imposed to protect young girls, regardless of the defendant's state of mind. Due diligence is not a defence to strict liability crimes. This means that even if the defendant did everything they should or could have, they will still be held liable. We can see this in the case of Shah. Here, the defendants, Shah and Shah, owned a newsagent shop where lottery tickets were sold. They instructed their staff not to sell tickets to anyone under the age of 16 and provided clear warnings and training on this issue. Despite their instructions, a staff member sold a lottery ticket to a 13-year-old without asking for proof of age. The court held that the offence under the National Lottery Act, 1993, was one of strict liability. Due diligence was not a defence because the offence required no proof of intent or negligence, only proof that the act of selling a ticket to a minor had occurred. In strict liability offences, liability arises simply from the prohibited act being committed regardless of precautions taken or intent. The presumption of mens rea refers to the principle that, unless explicitly stated otherwise, criminal offences are presumed to require mens rea in addition to the actus reus. This presumption ensures fairness by protecting individuals from being held criminally liable for unintended or innocent acts unless Parliament clearly intends otherwise. This principle is illustrated in the case of Sweet v. Parsley. In this case, a schoolteacher, Mrs. Sweet, let out her property to students who used it to smoke cannabis without her knowledge. She was charged under the Dangerous Drugs Act 1965, which made it an offence to manage premises used for drug consumption. The court held that mens rea was required because the statute did not explicitly state that it was a strict liability offence. Since Miss Sweet was unaware of the drug use, she was not guilty. Courts should presume mens rea is required unless there is clear evidence in the statute that Parliament intended to impose strict liability. The presumption of mens rea may be waived if the offence is regulatory in nature, often referred to as a quasi-criminal offence. The offence addresses a potential danger to public health, safety, or morals, where the harm prevention is of significant societal importance, or if making the offence strict liability will promote greater public care, diligence, and responsibility to prevent its commission, incentivizing adherence to legal standards. We can see this being applied in the case of Alpha Cell v. Woodward. Alpha Cell, a company, was convicted of polluting a river after an overflow from their plant occurred, despite them having no knowledge or intent for the pollution to happen. The court held it to be a strict liability offence to ensure companies took greater care in preventing environmental harm. In cases involving public health and safety, such as environmental protection, the courts may impose strict liability to encourage higher standards of prevention, even in the absence of mens rea. This case illustrates how strict liability promotes vigilance in areas affecting the public good. Strict liability can lead to the conviction of individuals or organisations who are morally innocent because there is no need to prove mens rea or fault. This means even those who take all reasonable precautions may still be found guilty if the prohibited act occurs. For example, in Harrow, London, Borough Council v. Shah and Shah, shop owners who diligently trained staff and warned them not to sell lottery tickets to minors were convicted when a staff member made an unintentional sale. This undermines the principle that criminal liability should only attach to blameworthy conduct, potentially damaging public perception of justice. Despite seeming unfair, strict liability in criminal law is justified in specific contexts to achieve particular policy goals and societal benefits. The key advantages include: number 1, protection of public health, safety, and welfare. Strict liability is often applied to offences involving areas of significant public concern, such as food safety, environmental protection, or product standards. The aim is to ensure high levels of vigilance and compliance, thereby reducing risks to the public. Example: in Alpha Cell, strict liability for pollution offences encouraged businesses to adopt stringent precautions to prevent environmental harm. Number 2, ease of prosecution. For regulatory or quasi-criminal offences, proving mens rea can be difficult and resource-intensive. Strict liability simplifies the prosecution's burden, focusing only on whether the prohibited act occurred, making enforcement more efficient.